Welcome to Hunters and Unicorns, the pre-sales edition of the 33 CXOs. Today, we welcome Phil Pergola. Phil is the global head of Customer Success 360 at VMware. In this episode, we discover his incredible journey through multiple leadership roles within pre- and post-sales, through which he achieved huge impact on the BladeLogic story. We also discover why customer success has become so essential to the growth of subscription-based technology companies. This is his playbook.
In the pre-sales edition of the 33 CXOs, we discover the crucial role that the pre-sales organization played in what is regarded as the greatest success story in the history of software sales. When John McMahon reunited the team at BladeLogic, he had a clear vision to create a sales and pre-sales organization that was in absolute unison. The symbiotic and almost telepathic sales rhythm is the benchmark for best practice. The outcome is not only execution excellence, but a shift to a value mindset which transcends any shift in technology. The pre-sales team now take executive positions at some of the fastest, most disruptive technology companies in the world. What we discover is that John McMahon's vision has not only changed how we sell, it's changed what we sell. Welcome to Hunters and Unicorns, the pre-sales edition of the 33 CXOs. I'm Simon Kutis and I'm joined by my co-host Patrick Harrison.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's an absolute honor to be joined by Phil Pergola. Phil, welcome.
Thanks, Simon. Good to be with you, Patrick.
Fantastic to have you, Phil. Thanks so much for joining us.
So in the way of an introduction, Phil Pergola is currently the global head of Customer Success 360 at VMware. In what's been a truly amazing career so far. Phil, we're actually going to spend quite a lot of time talking about your kind of most recent role, which is kind of VMware through the CloudHealth Inc. Acquisition. But actually, if you could just take us right to the beginning of how you got into BladeLogic, if you can kind of take us through that journey, that'd be a great place for us to start.
Sure. Yeah. So, I graduated from college and, went to work for, Anderson Consulting at the time, Accenture, and was doing consulting work there. And at one point, I said, listen, we keep doing these same software implementations. There's got to be a better way. So, I made the decision to go work at a startup company at the time called Egg Rock Partners, where, some of the members of the founding team at BladeLogic, were working at the time. And I worked with them a little bit, Vance Loisel, Vijay Menwani. Eventually, that company was acquired by a company called Breakaway Solutions, where David Adshiria was actually heading up the hosting business. And so, we joined up, with Dave at that point in time. The dot-com bust hits and, like many companies, we weren't doing too well financially. So, Dave and Vijay separately go off to be entrepreneurs in residence at different venture capital firms. I hung on, for a little bit longer and actually worked at a company that, acquired the assets of Breakaway Solutions. And then what happened is BladeLogic was founded in September of 2001. And BladeLogic had signed up their first large customer, Sprint, at the time. And in about May of 2002 or April 2002, Vance gave me a call and said, hey, we're starting up this company. We started up this company, BladeLogic. We've got our first customer. We'd love for you to come in and help build up all of our customer operational processes, professional services, customer support. Are you interested in joining? So I went in. I learned a little bit more about the company. It was pretty exciting. And then, Vijay Menwani at the time, was one of the founders, bought me an ice cream and gave me the hard sell and said, you need to join this company. And the next thing I know, I'm the director of client services, at BladeLogic. And so, it's a bit of a exciting kind of story to see how everything came together. And obviously, a lot of positive came out of joining BladeLogic.
Fantastic. And with director of client services, was that initially kind of professional services and support, kind of encompassing both those functions?
Yeah. And I don't want to oversell the role. I mean, at the time, literally the support and professional services organization was myself and one other person, David Miller, with some support and help from a couple of borrowed resources. But it was truly a startup, right? I mean,
yeah,
we really had to think about everything kind of post sale in terms of how we were going to serve the customer.
So it must have obviously been a very interesting time. You were kind of very early on, in that business to an extent. And you took various roles within the business, right? So your role didn't stand still, obviously, true startup nature, but actually you took different roles. So just kind of talk us through what different roles you took and why I suppose you were appointed to take that responsibility on.
Yeah, sure. So from when I joined to when we went public, it was just over 5 years. And I had, 4 roles that varied in duration from anywhere from like 12 to 18 months. And so, I joined as head of client services to build up, a mature and scalable professional services and support business. We established that, but early on, what we found is it wasn't a high enough volume of support activity and consulting activity to keep me and the team really engaged, based on the impact that we could have. So we took a step back and we said, well, what's the biggest challenge we're having right now in the business? And could we, best use our skills, have an impact in that area? And at the time, it was just, we had good, mature customer processes. We just needed more customers. So at the time, I took a role as the director of sales engineering, and really, my role was to help build up the sales engineering competency. Partnering closely, with the sales leadership. At the time, there was sort of a transition that was happening. Steve Sturhan was coming in as, the new head of sales. And so I, primarily worked with, Steve and some of the members of the team that helped me on the client services side to basically get sales engineering off the ground, implement new processes, things like that. Fast forward a little bit, we actually saw a ton of success bringing on new clients. But then what we looked at is we're like, wait a minute, we just closed, in one particular quarter, we closed, 6 large enterprise customers that all needed to be implemented. So I was basically at that point tapped on the shoulder to kind of go back and finish what I started, particularly on the professional services side. But also there were transitions happening in support. But most of my focus at that point was implementing the large deals that I helped sell. So I worked primarily in professional services, for a bit longer. But then what ended up happening is we said, well, what's the biggest problem that's impacting the success of our customers? And we really looked internally and we said, we've got some product issues. Basically the product that we had at the time wasn't really meeting the requirements and scale for the enterprise customers. And so I actually took a role at that time as the senior director of product management. And so I was at that point accountable for the release of what really became our flagship BladeLogic offering. When you look at kind of the capabilities and differentiators that we were able to put into the product at that point in time. Did that for a little while. I think about 12 to 18 months, and then we actually had some changes as it relates to kind of our engineering leadership at that point in time. And so that sort of created an opportunity to look at, where can I have the biggest business? And at that point in time, David Achiri, the CEO, tapped me on the shoulder and he said, we need to start thinking about what does this company need to look like from a customer perspective for us to have a really successful IPO. And he just laid it out clearly. He said, I want you to take an individual contributor role. Every resource in the company is at your disposal. And I need two things. One, I need to make sure we've got, a good reference customer base. Two, I need to make sure that we do not lose a customer to our primary competitor at the time, which was Opsware. And three, we need a very large reference financial services customer as part of our IPO roadshow. And so in that latter sense, I was kind of brought back into sort of the sales engineering because basically, I was tasked with sort of leading the charge from a sales engineering perspective at, winning our large financial services customer. And Bank of America was, the company that we targeted and eventually, we secured. And, who knows, to this day, I think they're probably the largest, BladeLogic customer, ever. They were for, definitely a long period of time. And that was a, that was a year-long sales cycle, involved partners, involved literally at one point in time, 80% of the sales engineering organization was, working on our trial at Bank of America. And then eventually, as we're going public, I was then, asked to solve, what the next big customer problem was, which was really at the time customer support. And so I was the VP of customer support as we went public, and eventually, with the acquisition of BMC, at that time I was the VP of customer support.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. It seems as though you were kind of moved, very, very strategically to tackle kind of big challenges or very, very strategic moves, almost like a chess piece, engaging in the right kind of areas at the right time. But BladeLogic was obviously going through a massive transition in itself at the time, obviously with John McMahon and Steve Strachan initially, and then John McMahon being brought in. What was the impact of those two particular sales leaders on BladeLogic as a total, but also what you then started to learn and therefore have to implement in the roles that you were taking on?
Yeah, sure. So, so as Steve came in, that's really when we started to put mature sales process, in place, right? Steve came from PTC, obviously, had worked, under John and had implemented, started to implement, many of the methodologies, the sales methodologies and practices that, he was using at PTC. And also Steve taught many of us really how to sell. I came into my role in sales engineering with no prior sales experience. If anything, I should tell people that, that's probably the one area I don't want to focus, right? Because I just didn't have experience. And I learned so much, at that point in time, from Steve. And then John came in, and John just took it to a totally different level, both in terms of the maturity of how we execute that process, but more importantly, doing it at scale globally, right? And looking at kind of, how we scale the organization globally. If you look at the level of talent that John was bringing in, as he came on board, and I had the opportunity actually to work for John, particularly, as part of my VP of customer success role. But just, in my various roles, I was always in the room, as part of the teams who were implementing force management, getting, all the training and enablement sessions, because we really looked at not only, how do we train those sales reps, but we also looked at, how do we enable all of those folks that were supporting the sales reps. And ultimately, there's also the handoff that happens from pre to post. At different points in time, regardless of what role I was in, I was in the room seeing the impact that he could have benefiting from the training, and then incorporating everything that I learned, not only into how we sell, but also into sort of my practice areas as well.
Fantastic. And in terms of, for our viewers, maybe for individuals really wanting to be successful in startups who are progressing their career, or individuals who like a varied role, what do you think made you so adaptable to such a variety of positions?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, you always look for in any position is, the raw talent that, someone brings to the table, right? I always think about in the software world, like 3 types of skills. I think of soft skills, I think about their job skills, like their ability to, whether it's, do sales engineering or, be a sales rep or customer success. And then I think of like technical, skills. And I think a lot of the soft skills are very adaptable, right, to different, roles. So for example, like, I really enjoy problem solving, right? And so that's a skill that can be applied to, all of those domain areas. And so I think, for folks as their career is like developing, I think, being comfortable taking risks to maybe go outside their comfort zone, but also, understanding what competencies that they bring to the table and how they can apply those to different roles. Because and at the end of the day, what I found in, my career is that diversity of experience, right? Diversity of experience is huge because, every role that I go to, I'm even better because of the diverse experience that I've had and the perspective that I can bring, to those roles.
Yeah. So having seen things from their side or that part of the business's side, it's kind of easier to integrate, in your opinion.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if I think about my role in professional services, oftentimes I'm trying to motivate salespeople to sell professional services. Well, then you turn it around a little bit and you're in sales and you're trying to get the deal done and you have the professional services team coming, say you need to get this professional services in the deal. And,
yeah,
one of the things, I learned, from Steve and John is, right, time kills all deals, right? So you see it from a completely different lens, but ultimately it's like, how does it all come together so that everyone accomplishes their objectives and you do it in a positive way.
So obviously the playbook was building momentum in the sense that obviously John and Steve are now really imposing these methodologies on you. How profound was that teaching on you personally?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's, so it was significantly profound because, I think if I look at it through a couple of different lenses. So one is I was always very, like a process oriented person from earlier in my career. But what I learned, with John is, the importance of like a sales process and really kind of it brought, sort of clarity, to that. I was always a methodical person in terms of how I think about, tackling problems, managing my teams, right? And so, applying things like MedPick as it relates to, forecasting as an example. And then also just learning, some of the intricacies, I think, and this has come up in other, podcasts as well, is it's one thing to sort of read a book or an article on, some of these methodologies. I mean, I literally have the laminated sales process from every job that I've ever had. I actually have I have a suitcase that was a gift from Morgan Stanley on our IPO. And in that suitcase is literally a laminated copy of all the sales processes for all the orgs I've worked, through. And I think it's one thing to look at that and read it, but it's another thing to experience it and really learn how to apply it, right? You don't learn how to drive a car by reading a manual, right? You learn how to drive a car by hours of experience and making mistakes. And I think, the experience of working with those leaders, was super profound in my ability to not only apply that, but also refine my craft. As over time I've gotten into customer success and I've started to expand that process, look beyond, the pre-sale cycle and apply that, sort of post-sale and apply some of those concepts, for the entire customer life cycle. That's been huge.
Was there a defined customer success function in BladeLogic, or was it more of a
yes and no? I mean, I think so. Generally, no. At the time, BladeLogic is, it's a perpetual software business, right? So you got your traditional perpetual software and maintenance. We took the traditional transactional approach to how we served our customer, meaning you had, project-based professional services. You had, ticket-driven support activities. And so, the only point in time where there was an element of customer success was when Dave tapped me on the shoulder and said, basically, the whole company is at your disposal. Like, go make sure we don't lose any customers and go make sure, we win and make successful a large financial services client, right? But that wasn't an investment in customer success. That was an investment in a person and more of a company-wide initiative. And so I think customer success, I use the term, it's both a noun and a verb, right? It's a culture, right? A company can be, maniacally focused on the success of their customers across every organization. And that's sort of the verb. And then there's the noun, which is like an organization. And I think what you've seen since BladeLogic is the rise of a lot of subscription and SaaS-based companies. And ultimately, in a subscription and SaaS-based company, customer success is one of the lifebloods of the business. In fact, it's one of the organizations could have the biggest impact on the success of a recurring revenue business. And a lot of the early SaaS companies, Salesforce being the most notable one that's, documented, really found that the absence of a customer success function can actually really kill the company's growth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is obviously a very, very kind of a key topic and something which is obviously very dear to you. And we are going to talk quite a lot about, a lot of the work that you have done, within this space and how you've really started to adapt much of that early best practice from BladeLogic in your roles and how that's kind of trickled through. This would be probably a really good segue into, post IPO at BladeLogic going into BMC, because again, we see a further a further change in your role and focus at BMC. So can you just kind of tell us, what that acquisition was like and, what your new role was within BMC as part of that acquisition?
Sure. Yeah, it was an interesting acquisition, right? Because you have this small company, BladeLogic, being acquired by this large company, kind of BMC. I think at the time BMC was, directionally about, $2 billion in, annual revenue. So significantly larger than, what BladeLogic was at that point in time. But at the same token, what you saw is, BladeLogic became the cornerstone of, VMware's, service automation capability at the time. But more importantly, I think the bigger impact was the impact that the leadership of BMC had on, the broader organization. So, you saw, David Echeria move into, a role as the president of basically, the equivalent of the distributed systems business as opposed to, the mainframe business at that point in time, which was about half the company. So you saw, John moving into a role in terms of, leading the sales organization. You saw a lot of the sales leaders and reps getting really important positions in the BMC sales organization. And so, I think particularly in that context, you saw sort of a shift in terms of, how we went to market. And ultimately, that really, kind of played an important role in many respects transforming, the company, right, at that point in time in terms of, particularly how we were selling. And then I think, for me personally, as I've got involved, as you mentioned, I had a shift as well, right? So at the point of acquisition, I was running support for, BladeLogic. So the obvious place for me to go was the BMC support organization. But also, very quickly, I stepped in. I think one of my peers said to me, she's like, I can't believe how vocal you were in your first meeting with this team that you had sort of, just met. And so, I finished integrating BladeLogic, a little bit, sort of faster than anyone expected. And I, at that point in time, was, tapped on the shoulder to lead BMC's premier support organization, which basically, meant I went from focusing on, just my BladeLogic and extended automation portfolio to actually focusing on, BMC's largest, most strategic accounts across all the portfolios, right? So all the different product areas, which at the time, BMC's big product area was, a product called Remedy and Atrium, which is a CMDB product. And so, I was now focusing across the entire portfolio of products, at that point in time, and was able to have an impact from a support perspective, again, beyond just, my experience at BladeLogic.
Sure. And how was that transition from obviously having a varied role, but more with a point solution or a point product to then having a much wider set of products? Was it, again, a learning curve, or was it just a case of doing things differently?
Yeah, well, so it was a little bit of both. I mean, I think there was a lot of foundational things that, I had sort of in my tool bag, so to speak, as it relates to, being very like process centric. Obviously I had support domain experience, but not at that level of scale. I did learn a lot from, as part of my BladeLogic experience, in terms of, managing enterprise customers, which I was able to kind of tap into. There were obviously new elements as well. The amount of revenue that we drove, both in Premier support fees as well as the maintenance fees for my Premier support business, was, rivaled the amount of revenue that BladeLogic had at the time of acquisition, right? So I think, when you look at, the fact that, we had this 4-fee premium support offering, that, finding fees for that plus the maintenance that I was accountable for, was in, over 100 million, in revenue. That was sort of a new experience, for me. So, it was a little bit of both. I was able to leverage a lot of my experience, but at the same token, there was sort of new skills that I needed to develop as well. And I also had to adjust from working in a startup environment to working in, a 6,000 person, software company, which is, it's a large company, but, significantly larger than like BladeLogic, but maybe not as large as, where I am today, like VMware.
Yeah.
So one of your playbook elements, Phil, is the customer engagement model. Was it at BMC when you really started to kind of roll this kind of playbook out and kind of develop your whole mindset around this?
Yeah, I think that's evolved in like two different ways. I think there's always been this discussion of like, you have a sales process, and then like, how do you hand the customer off to the post-sales process? And so in a lot of respects, keeping it simple, people historically have thought about it as sort of, two different journeys for the customer, the pre-sales and the post-sale. And that concept sort of still exists. But I think, where the concept of the customer engagement model is sort of evolved in my mind, really start to take hold as I started to get into EnterNOC, and really cemented itself when I joined CloudHealth. And I think a primary driver of that is, the fact that, CloudHealth was really, was 100%, SaaS subscription. And so you sort of see this shift where in a perpetual license world, the majority of the value you actually get from the customer happens on the initial sale, right? So, two things are taking place. One, they're making this capital investment in a perpetual license. And then also, when they look at the amount of investment they're making in the license, they're often more apt to make a more significant investment in things like professional services and implementation and other things, associated with, their success, right? Because they're making oftentimes a multi-year commitment at that point in time. Even if they're only thinking about like 12 months, oftentimes, when you buy a perpetual license, you're buying the license in perpetuity, right? When you look at a SaaS business, right, you start to see customers that are more interested in try and buy. And on the sales side of things, you see concepts like land and expand, right? We're going to land a smaller deal initially. And if you just look at the economics of the SaaS business, right, rather than having, this big upfront perpetual purchase and then this small maintenance stream, you sort of have this continuous subscription stream, which over time, is more revenue for the company, right? I mean, there's a reason why SaaS companies have a higher valuation than, traditional perpetual-based software companies. And so, understanding that dynamic of, subscription and land and expand, and also the fact that the customer is not making as large of an investment in implementing the technology, right? They don't have to install it, because oftentimes it's in the cloud, right? If it's a SaaS product, it's in the cloud. And so oftentimes they're not making as much initial upfront investment. And so what ends up happening is you actually move from a mode of, the majority of your selling happening during that pre-sale stage to a mode where you're constantly in a selling mode. And so, we've implemented a customer engagement model that's based on this concept called LAER, L-A-E-R, which is, you got to land the customer. You've got to get them to adopt the technology. Once they're adopting the technology, that's when you swoop in and look at expansion, whether that's expanding from an upsell perspective in terms of like, getting more units of consumption, or that's expansion from a cross-sell perspective. What other products can I sell? And then also renewals is, another critical aspect of the business, and also, just retention in general. How do you retain the customer? And based on the company, a lot of those expansion and retention activities, those are commercial sales activities, which, need kind of equal amounts of rigor as you would have in a traditional sales process.
That's really interesting. And how do you think those changes to both the industry and the way technology companies have responded in terms of being in that perpetual sales mode, as you say, do you think that has really changed the standards of the industry? Do you think that's had a positive effect overall? Or what would you
Yeah, I think long term it's going to have a positive impact in two respects. I think, when you look at it through the lens of shareholders, right? In SaaS subscription business, over time, customers end up spending more money on the software. When you look at it through the lens of a customer, the customer has a lot more flexibility, and there's more of a focus on delivering business outcomes for the customer. So even though the customer is paying a little bit more, they're actually getting a lot more, right? Because they now have flexibility. They've sort of shifted from this, CapEx to OpEx, sort of model. They've got the ability to kind of turn things on and off. And really there's a lot more power that shifts to the customer. So even though they're paying a little bit more money, they're actually, they've got more flexibility, they've got more control. And there's a lot more focus on the outcome. And when you look at it from an employee perspective, what ends up happening is, this whole new category of roles that never existed before, like customer success managers, is, one of the biggest, roles on LinkedIn right now that people are looking for. And that category of roles didn't exist, really 10 years ago, right? When I was back at BladeLogic, no one had a role of a customer success manager, right? There were very few, if any, customer success. So there's this whole category of roles that exist, all new, right? It's complementary to the traditional post-sales roles like, consulting and professional services and support. So overall, I mean, it's, I think it has a positive effect, for everyone involved.
Sure.
So I suppose in terms of these principles that you've kind of just taken us through the layer kind of process that you follow, how have you started to then implement the MEDPICK style qualification process within that?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a great question. So, so first, I obviously, at BladeLogic, had experience, with MEDPICK or MedPick, depending on which flavor, or which sales leader you're working with. And so, that was obviously very embedded in kind of how we did things from a sales perspective. As things evolve, that methodology was also adopted at some of the subsequent companies that I worked at. So, when I was at Enternoc, actually, John McMahon helped, place me at Enternoc. He was advising them, at the time. The sales leader there, we were building a software business, they were learning about software sales. We implemented it there. Certainly we had it at BMC, but, at CloudHealth, what I started to do, so first, my sales leader at CloudHealth also used, his variation of, MedPick. But what I started to look at kind of, in the context of SaaS and the context of post-sales, how can I apply these concepts, as it relates to kind of inspecting my forecast, right? So I have, today, I continue, even though I have a new role at VMware, I continue to be accountable for, both the majority of the retention of, the recurring revenue business, which is, over 100 million in recurring revenue. I continue to be responsible for, the majority of the expansion that we drive, the renewals of the contracts. And so I need a way to forecast all of those things. And so what I looked at, okay, how can I apply these concepts in a customer success, world? So for example, we're still transacting, right? I use MedPick actually, because as part of, for example, VMware, one of the things that we need to do is every time we renew a CloudHealth transaction, I need to migrate it to VMware legal terms, right? And new things like data protection agreements have emerged in a cloud-based world. So I really need to understand the paper process. right? And understand where we are. If I'm going to forecast accurately, I need to understand where we are in the paper process as we migrate to legal terms of service or we get a data protection agreement in place. The concept of a champion, right? So that's not a concept, just a pre-sales concept. At the end of the day, for me, in a post-sales world, the value of a champion is, still having someone who's going to sell on your behalf when you're not in the room. Well, to drive adoption of a technology solution, we still need that selling to happen post-sales. And we also have conversations about, well, what happens if we lose our champion, right? I mean, in the technology world, the IT world, people are taking jobs every 2 to 3 years, right? So we're constantly in this mode of developing champions. We're always asking, who's the economic buyer? Ultimately, who makes the decision? Have you met with them? How often are you meeting with them? Now, what we're also doing, though, is we're applying in the customer success world and using tools like, Gainsight. We're also applying using data to also inspect things and create workflows around things like, well, you haven't met with the economic buyer recently, right? So every executive business review, we know one of my team members, we know when they meet with the economic buyer, their champion. We know, how often they meet. We know if the LinkedIn profile of that person changes. We know that we need to go build a new champion, right? So we're using data now to actually even reinforce some of these concepts and proactively identify risk in the business through the use of things like, health scores and calls to action. And so we've really taken this one forecast methodology concept and started to think about how we can integrate it in other ways to ultimately help deliver, the business results as it relates to, growing our customer base.
So data-driven operations is again another element of your playbook, which is what you're referring to there. Could you just tell us a little bit more about, some of the elements of that?
Sure. Yeah. So you can look at your business, from a metrics perspective in two respects. So if you think of the customer engagement model, starting all the way back through marketing and sales, and then getting into, customer success, you got to onboard the customer, you got to drive adoption, eventually get expansion, retention. There are different metrics along the way, right? There are leading indicators, there are trailing indicators, right? So, if you take, for example, in the sales process, a leading indicator might be the number of trials in your trial win rate, right? There's trailing indicators like in the customer success world. Net retention is a big KPI that we use, which is, the value of the business, the value of the customer business at the beginning of the period and the end of the period, right? Did you grow your install base? And then there's also productivity metrics, right? So, obviously on the sales side of things, a lot of people talk about, sales productivity, but you can look at each stage and you can look at the roles that are involved in that stage of the customer engagement model. And you can look at how do you measure productivity, right? And so there's sort of the classic, metrics, it's like sales productivity, like utilization and professional services. But there's other metrics, in a sort of a new world with customer success, when you look at, what's the amount of recurring revenue that a particular customer success manager is actually, kind of managing, as an example, right? Or, a lot of people talk about, the number of customers, right? But ultimately, you figure out the productivity metric that, works for you. So that's one aspect of, data-driven operations, right? The second aspect is this concept of like health score. And so in that sense, what we could do is, there's sort of different lens you can apply to a health score. There's a customer-centric lens, which is like what metrics are indicative of a healthy customer. And oftentimes people will share those. So that's kind of one approach. And that's the approach, we're using at VMware right now. And ultimately those metrics are grounded in two concepts. They're grounded in the concept of, outcome. Is the customer actually getting the business outcome they expect? An experience, right? So an example of outcome is, our customers purchase CloudHealth oftentimes to save money. So we can actually look at our customers and we can look at the total amount of money they're spending on cloud, and we can look at, the number of units, whether that's compute or storage or network, and we can look at their cost per instance hour and see if that number is going up or down. And that's directly correlated with their business outcome. And so that's an example of a metric we might look at that's customer centric. Other things are like NPS, right? As well. Those are customer centric metrics. Some of them are outcomes, some of them are experience. You can also look at it from an internal perspective, and this is really kind of where we lean more on the CloudHealth, business is we try to predict a customer's propensity to expand, and we try to predict whether a customer is at risk of churning. And we've used, basically data science to figure out the metrics that are most strongly correlated with their likelihood to either churn, right, cancel their contract and leave, or their likelihood, to expand. So for example, like we may get a positive net promoter score, which is a great thing, but it's not tightly correlated with their likelihood to stay with us, right? So we have lots of times, I'll have, one of our champions give us a really positive net promoter score. But at the end of the day, they cancel the contract. Why? They just had a, reorganization, and a new executive came in, and he's worked with, a prior, one of our competitors in the past, right? So there's not necessarily a correlation. On the flip side of that, if your executive sponsor gives you a negative net promoter score, like there's a high likelihood that they're going to, churn if the person that ultimately makes the decision isn't saying good things about you, right? So that's just kind of like one example. And we've got about 25 metrics that, we tend to kind of focus on, things like contract length, things like, are we seeing kind of a continual investment in our technology? Adoption is obviously huge, right? In a SaaS world, you can, what features people are using, you know what consumption, is happening. And we dabbled in actually some of that, actually even as early as, BladeLogic, where we actually could correlate, based on a customer at the time, they had to redeem a license key every time they deployed BladeLogic. We could monitor their license key trends, and we could actually, and we did this at BladeLogic, we could actually look at whether they were using license keys and continually, getting new license keys was directly correlated as to whether they were going to continue to use the software. And so they're just examples more internally focused where how you can use metrics to predict, risk in the business and also where your expansion opportunities are.
So obviously a lot of that focus is very much around you as the vendor and the benefit, but actually this can also have a profound impact on the client. So what value did that mindset also bring to the client side?
Yeah. Well, so first, like as we use like health scores at VMware, like that's really where we're focused right now, is looking at it through the lens of the customer. And so, I think what ends up happening is you almost, as a software vendor, end up holding yourself more accountable to sort of the value that you sold in the sales process, right? So if I think about kind of how we're operating now, so, during the sales process, we set expectations of value, right? What we do, and a lot of that is captured either in the deliverables you put together as part of your sales process, right? So think of this as, you've got a CFO ready presentation that you put in front of the customer with a business case. And then you also have internal deliverables too, like an account plan, right? Where you map the organization and all the key stakeholders. So what we're working on is, how do we take that and then, work with the customer to create this thing called a success plan, which basically maps to how are they going to measure success. We're then codifying that success plan in software. And then we're actually measuring through executive business reviews whether we're actually on track, to deliver on that outcome. And we're putting governance in place so that if we're not on track, we can take action. And that accountability is a mutual accountability, right? At the end of the day, we could do everything right as it relates to our software, and the customer can still not accomplish the outcome. But just the fact that the software vendor is working in partnership with the customer through the life of their journey, right? Not on a transactional basis, like, traditional project-based professional services or, ticket-driven support, but more, really embedded, with the customer over their journey, with this focus on making sure they get the outcomes. I mean, that's really, profound, right? And that has a huge impact, not only for the customer, but it also has an impact, for the company as well. Because at the end of the day, if you deliver that positive, business outcome for the customer and they have a good experience, then they're more likely to continue to buy more from you as well.
So do you provide them with some sort of scorecard quarterly, or what do you provide your customers with?
Yeah, so we do two things. So we have a scorecard, right? So we have, a health scorecard. Uh, and ultimately, that is then incorporated typically into like a standard executive business review that we do. So we have a very prescriptive approach. I started this at CloudHealth. We have a very prescriptive approach for how we do executive business reviews. In the case of the CloudHealth, we also do benchmarking, right? So we also give them visibility of how they're performing against others.
Wow.
Which the customers find super valuable. I call that that's the CXO moment, right? We go to do our executive business review. We bring up the benchmark. I've been in many meetings where the executive has paused the meeting, gone out, came back in, and now some top higher level executive comes in. He's like, you got to see this, right? So there's sort of this, it's very much, centered around the customer business value. So whether it's the scorecard, but as I said, in the CloudHealth world, we do these benchmarks. We delivered that as part of the executive business review, which is oftentimes, a 60 to 90-minute meeting. We have a very structured agenda. We do it on a cadence that we agree with the customer. For your largest customers, it might be, quarterly. If you do it 3 times a year, you're doing a pretty good job because you're dealing with, economic buyers and their schedule. But it basically creates sort of a foundation from a relationship perspective, but also from a governance perspective in terms of making sure, you're always on track. And then the other thing it does is it, creates a communication vehicle, because the reality is that technology is changing so fast. Our customers are transforming at rapid rates, and our customers' businesses are changing so fast that, ultimately you also have to kind of make sure that you're always, keeping your eye on what success looks like at any point in time. Because the reality is more often than not, 6 months after you close the initial deal or 6 months after your last meeting, something has changed.
Yeah, that's so. In terms of who received that scorecard, you kind of touched on it briefly there, but you kind of mentioned economic buyers. Who is that? Is it just the economic buyers, or how do you identify who should receive that information?
Yeah, so what we try to do as part of the sales process is we try to identify who our executive sponsor is going to be. The executive sponsor sometimes is the economic buyer. Oftentimes the executive sponsor is someone that is, sort of designated or delegated by the economic buyer to make sure that the value is actually, received. Sometimes the executive sponsor is our champion. Sometimes, they're not, right? They could just be someone in the organization who has, a lot of influence. And so, in a perfect world, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're having, we call them executive business reviews. Because we have a prescriptive approach to the business review, but it's not an executive business review if the executive sponsor's not there. Most commonly, you would you'd want your champion involved as well if they're the same person or someone else. Those are kind of like the two key roles. And then the other piece we always think about is, well, how are we making sure that the economic buyer knows about the value that we're delivering, and how are we communicating that value? And sometimes that's just as simple as doing the work of preparing the executive business review presentation. And then the other piece is, also we've even with some of our customers, we worked with the marketing organization to do case studies. It has a, dual benefit, right? It has the benefit that you could use it for marketing purposes, and drive more sales, but also has the benefit that the customer can use it to market internally. And ultimately, that drives goodwill. That's how people get promoted.
Yeah, sure. So what happens if the priorities change within the economic buyer and the kind of senior exec?
Yeah, and so as we're engaging with the customer, we need to look at how those priorities have changed, and then we need to think about, okay, as a result of that, how would we respond, right? COVID is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
So if you take COVID as an example, so COVID was very interesting in two respects. So one, we had a significant velocity of executive business reviews with our customers that were happening. COVID hits, and now everyone goes into kind of tactical, sort of mode. Now, many of the companies that we work with are companies that are, growing really fast or transforming their businesses, and they're transforming them in the context of the public cloud. And so, for a lot of companies, what ended up happening is instead of focusing on growth, which is where their focus was, they all of a sudden with COVID saw that, there was going to be impacts to their business. So think about like a travel business, right? Where people aren't flying as much. So some of our customers fall into that category. And so in those customer cases, now all of a sudden their priorities went from growth to basically how do they better, manage their business from in terms of like costs and things like that, and mitigating risk. So in a lot of cases, security, was equal or more important. And so priorities changed, right? So whereas in the past, maybe we would spend 20% of our time with a growth-oriented company talking about how are they optimizing their costs, now all of a sudden that flips to 80% of the time, right? And so we sort of, adjust, things. So that's, one of the things. I think the other thing, that changes too is things like being able to meet with customers face to face versus, delivering things, digitally. And we've always been, we have to support the largest customers and the smallest customers. So we have a strategy, for doing everything we talked about, efficiently for the smallest customers all the way through, a very high touch approach to the largest customers, but that changes things as well.
Fantastic. I think that's such valuable in-depth insight really into the way the industry is going and how not just the customer success function is growing, but the way the industry is moving. I guess as well as the process and the operational side, which is so vital, to scale the organization, obviously you need to bring in, and this is another element of your playbook, recruit, retain, and develop the right talent. In a relatively new role such as customer success, how do you find that challenge? Are there certain priorities you look for, or obviously I'm sure you have hiring criteria as any medic playbook company will?
Yeah. So it's interesting, when I meet a recruiter, typically like an internal recruiter, but if I were to meet you guys in a different context, the first thing I usually tell my recruiter is I said, you're going to love me or you're going to hate me, right? And the reason I say that is because I think, at the end of the day, you can have the best processes in the world, you can have the best systems in the world, you can have the best product in the world, but at the end of the day, you still need, marketing people to market, salespeople to sell, right? Customer success is, a lot of it is about, kind of the human interaction. We do tons with technology, but then smart people have to figure out what we're going to automate, right? Like, so there's always at the end of the day, there's some talent, kind of behind the scenes. And so, I put a huge priority on, basically the recruiting process. And what we focus on a lot is, one, like what's the profile that we're going to look for in a candidate? And we get really into what are the specific competencies and behaviors we want to see out of our candidates. And at the end of the day, we know there's certain things that we can teach, right? If I think back to like BladeLogic, when we were building up the sales engineering team, we didn't say go find sales engineers, who've sold, Tivoli or Unicenter. No, we didn't do that. What we said is well, who's our customer, right? Our customers are typically system administrators. Okay, great. So what do we need? Well, we need people who technically understand system administration and can technically, get their heads around our software. But we also need soft skills, right? Like, we need people that, are competitive, and we need people that, at the time, a lot of systems engineers, and even today, a lot of them are, introverted. Well, no, we need people who are a bit more out, kind of like talking to customers, and we need people that can build relationships. And so we kind of focus a bit more on those skills. And so we can teach them to do demos. We can teach them to do trials of our software, right? We can teach them the features and functions of BladeLogic. And so in today's world, as I'm recruiting for customer success professionals, it's in such high demand, one. And two, it's kind of, still early in its, progression, and it means different things, right? Some customer success professionals are commercially oriented because they do renewals and expansion. Some customer success professionals are technically oriented because they do onboarding and adoption. So ultimately, we end up getting back to like, well, what skills do they need that are the skills that we can't train? And let's go, recruit for that, right? And that's, things like problem solving, right? Things like, good communication skills, right? Things like, how do they handle adversity, right? Are they flexible and adaptable to change, right? So we recruit for those things. And then we have a very structured interview process where it's everyone knows at every stage what their goal in the interview process is to ultimately drive, the best level of talent. So there's sort of the recruiting aspect. There's obviously the professional development aspect, right? Then what do you do when they show up, right?
Yeah.
And then that's an important aspect of things as well. And so I apply this sort of 70-20-10 sort of approach. 10% of it is have them read a book, have them go to a class. 20% of it's like coaching, and the other 70% is they just got to go out and get real world experience, and supporting them through that. And then the other part is organizational design, as well. Like, how are we designing the organization in a way that, is going to, set the individuals up for success and also deliver the best experience for our customers.
Fantastic. And for those people already with a curiosity for customer success or who've thought about entering the customer success industry already, obviously, as we know, it's really important for people to play to their strengths. What should they be looking out for? Do they need a baseline always of technical knowledge, or do you think it's more that nature of the person?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. So one is, they need to have a bit of a passion for the thing that they're driving customer success for, right?
Yeah.
And that's not always obvious either. I mean, one of the most successful customer success individuals, she's a director now, but she started as an individual contributor. She was an FP&A analyst, right? But one of the personas that, for CloudHealth that we deal with is FP&A, right? So, she probably didn't know it at the time. But there was, she had some interest in, that area, and eventually that helped her flourish, kind of over time. So I think there's, having an interest in the domain, I think is important, because if you have an interest in it, you're going to invest the time to learn, right? And then I think it just comes down to then just, some of the soft skills and drive, that the individual has to become an expert, at that profession.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of equally important. I mean, the reality is that, every day new technologies are, being introduced. There's, a new service that shows up in the AWS catalog. There's a new, app or a new, a new software vendor that's out there. No one's going to know all of the software itself. It's just they've got to be smart enough to learn.
Fantastic. And in terms of the kind of the future of customer success, if you like, do you see this becoming even more important than the new business sales side? Do you see the industry changing further as to the distance it's already come?
Yeah, I wouldn't say anything is like more important versus less important. I think, the way I think about things is, from a customer engagement model perspective, at different stages in the customer journey, there are different roles that need to kind of rise up, right? So that starts with marketing, right? So marketing has this sort of a critical role early on as it relates to, driving leads, right? Yeah. And then it shifts to, the sellers, right? And sales engineering to make sure that, we can get the initial land, whether that's a large deal, right? Or a land and expand opportunity. Then it shifts to, the customer success teams, and that includes, roles like customer success managers, but also, support and professional services, and I have the luxury of managing kind of all of those, sort of today. The responsibility shifts, but every one of those has a different role, right? The professional services team, they have their role. The support team, they have their role. And then maybe on the expansion side of things, maybe that expansion is driven by the customer success team. Maybe that expansion is driven by the original sellers. There are different models that companies use for, expansion. Then you have kind of the renewal, right? If you do everything right up front, some people say the renewal is a foregone conclusion. I actually think the renewal is an opportunity for expansion, right? Every renewal is an opportunity for expansion. But also, a large percentage of my business, with smaller customers, we have auto renewals, right? So if you do everything right up front, the renewal takes care of itself, right? So everyone has a role. And ultimately for a recurring revenue business, you start out, the beginning of every period, you start out with a book of business, right? So, at the beginning of the period, you might have 100 million in recurring revenue, right? The customer success team, has two jobs. One is to minimize the amount of churn, right? And so, if you have 20% churn, that's 20 million in recurring revenue that the new sales business has to go find, right? And so you might have 20 reps that are just offsetting the churn, right? And so you want to obviously minimize that, right? You want to get that number, down 10% or below. That's sort of, the first thing. And then the second piece is the expansion element. Because, what we found, at CloudHealth, for example, is, over 50% of our business was actually just being driven by existing customers.
Wow.
And so the customer success team, regardless of who does the expansion, the customer success team is accountable for making sure, what I call making sure the customer is always in the buying mode, right? And so there's sort of that element as well. So, the more you take care of your customers, you minimize the churn, you maximize the expansion. And then when that's working in conjunction with the new business, when those things are working in conjunction, that's when you see the maximum amount of growth. But you also see the best economics as it relates to your cost of sale, as you think about things like the cost of expansion, the cost of renewals, as well as the cost of new business.
Right. So I just at this point want to just go through kind of chronologically just to help our viewers and our listeners understand your kind of trajectory, because we've traveled from BMC all the way through to kind of the present day. So obviously BMC, you were Director of Premium Customer Support, May 2008 to April 2012. You were then made Area Vice President of Professional Services, which saw you through to kind of March 2014. At which point you joined Ennoc. You mentioned earlier that obviously John McMahon was quite instrumental in kind of facilitating that, where you joined as the VP for Global Services and Customer Success. And after a very successful stint there, which was approximately kind of 3 years, you made your way to CloudHealth Technologies as the VP of Customer Success, and you've obviously stayed through the acquisition of VMware. Now, I suppose framing that, VMware is an organization which isn't a thoroughbred medic kind of John McMahon force management company. They obviously do implement a lot of that. But from a personal perspective, how we've heard many sales engineers or professional services individuals that just can't thrive in an environment which isn't completely intertwined with that thoroughbred medic environment. But how have you survived and how have you thrived in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. So one is, first, you can't assume that just because you're, small or an individual, you can't have a big impact, right? So, we saw that with, BladeLogic being acquired by BMC, right? Where, a small number of individuals had a big impact on a much larger company. Similarly, when CloudHealth was acquired by VMware, CloudHealth brought things to the table that were not part of, VMware's DNA. First, public cloud knowledge and experience, right? When you think of VMware, you think of the opposite of the public cloud, right? The other thing is SaaS, right? VMware, a lot of the revenue is historically has been significantly like perpetual maintenance sort of model, right? So those are skills and experience, right? As well as customer success. That's another thing that, VMware, had multiple, starts and stops as it relates to customer success. So if I think of just my skills as it relates to public cloud, as it relates to SaaS, as it relates to customer success, as well as all the foundational skills, that I have, like, I just think about I call it punching above your weight class, right? So just because you're an individual or a small company, you can have a profound impact, because at VMware's, working on this transformation to shifting more and more revenue to subscription and SaaS. And the people that are the best at that are part of this small little acquisition called CloudHealth. And so much like BladeLogic had an influence on BMC, like we're trying to do sort of, the same thing. And at times that goes really well. And at other times, as you highlight, something that can be frustrating, right? Because I think, I've got to learn how the sales organization operates, and I've got to ask myself, are they operating in a way that's going to get us, to sort of, where we want to go? And sometimes organizations are open to change and change quickly, and other times organization, move slowly. And so the thing I look at is that pace of change, right? As we bring in these new skill sets, is the organization investing in the change that's required to take advantage of these skill sets or competencies? and and as long as positive things are happening, it's motivating, right?
Mm.
Right. So your current role now, you've obviously moved into the global head of customer success 360. So what is your mission right now in the role that you're in?
Yeah. So really, the big thing we're focusing on right now is as VMware shifts from being a perpetual business to more and more of a subscription and SaaS business, how does our engagement model with the customers change around the customer journey in a subscription and SaaS world? And a big underpinning of that, in addition to the journey itself and the engagement model itself and the changes that need to happen there, is also having a mature customer success function, right? And then very specifically, where I'm focused is as it relates to two things. One is how we deliver customer success for our largest and most strategic customers, and then two, how do you build an economic model where you can make investments in customer success, but at the same token, you can do it in a way that fits within, sort of the profitability profile that, you're trying to drive. And one of the things we did early on at CloudHealth was, really from the first month that I started, I said, we're going to charge for customer success. Why? Because the other vendors in the space that we're in, they charge. And we were able to very quickly go from having zero attach rate, zero customer success revenue up through the majority of the time the customer funding customer success. And so at VMware, we're also looking at that as well. Is there a way to get the customers to fund these customer success investments? And there's a lot of examples in the industry, both in kind of the IT infrastructure space where we play, as well as in other industries, large SaaS companies, where customers do pay for customer success. So it's a combination of how we serve, these large enterprise customers, but also do it in a way that, kind of meets our profitability model, but all of it with an emphasis on how we support this company-wide transformation to subscription.
Mm.
Right.
Fantastic. And just to move back slightly in time, Phil, so at Enoch, where you were VP of Global Services and Customer Success from 2014 to 2017, what was it that drew you to customer success yourself? Was it the need within the business that you discovered this new area, or what were the kind of key drivers for you?
Yeah, sure. So if we actually look at kind of how customer success is defined in a lot of organizations, I mean, some take a very narrow definition, which is you're going to manage the team of customer success managers, right? And they're going to do like onboarding and adoption, or maybe they're going to do renewals, or maybe they're going to have a role in expansion, right? And so that's sort of kind of one way to look at it. I've kind of sort of been interested in broader roles. In the case of Enoch and actually even at CloudHealth, we started to define customer success back in the sales process. And it starts with basically the sales engineering function. And so in a SaaS world, when you do a trial of software, that is actually the initial implementation. Like if you do it right, your initial implementation of software actually happens pre-sales. So the customer in a perfect world is actually getting value out of your software when you close the initial deal.
Yeah.
And so customer success starts pre-sales. And so in the roles that I've had at Enoch, at CloudHealth, it started pre-sales. It then moved into all aspects post-sales of managing the customer. Mm-hmm. And that, was inclusive of onboarding the customer, including the initial implementation, the support aspects, proactively driving adoption, looking at expansion and playing a significant role in expansion, as well as playing a significant role, commercial role in both expansion and renewals. Mm-hmm. And so I've looked at it more broadly, and what drew me to that was the fact that I had experience running sales engineering, the fact that I experienced running professional services, the fact that I experienced running, support, the fact that I experienced doing premium, offers, premium, more proactive services. And then also kind of just a mindset to think about, we talk about the engagement model in the context, you can think of it in the context of a process, but you can also think of it in the context of segmentation as well. And for me, that's like two things. It's direct versus channel. And then it's large customers, versus medium-sized customers versus small customers. And I've also, I've had experience, on both sides, both on the direct side as well as the channel side. I've had experience working, with outsourcers, both earlier in my career, working for an outsourcer, as well as, kind of later in my career. And so it really had, for me, it was kind of bringing all this stuff together under one remit. And then applying just, all the operational discipline that I had, learned over the years, into having a positive business outcome, for the companies that I work for.
Sure. So I do want to ask you about diversity, Phil, because customer success in general seems to be a very good opportunity to expand, with diversity. Kind of just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at diversity in like two respects. There's diversity of experience, which is something that, I've really benefited from in my career. And then you can look at diversity in terms of, diversity of, thought, right? So, and you can look at that through different lens. Like at VMware right now, there's a big focus on underrepresented minorities and, sort of the male-female balance, right? Think about that through a software company where certain organizations, tend to be very like male dominated and others. And there's lots of aspects. That's just one simple way to think of diversity. But obviously, when you think of diversity of thought, there's lots of different aspects that, you can consider. And so, that is an important thing that we try to focus on for a couple of different reasons. One is our customers are diverse, right? I think that's, an important thing that, we think about. Two, what I've learned is I've tried to balance there's a lot of great things I learned in my career. A lot of it coming out of, BladeLogic in terms of, how I've seen things operate. But at the same token, I value getting other people's sort of perspectives. And what I try to do is sort of take the best of all of those things, right? So, take all the best things that, came from like BladeLogic and some of those things obviously came from PTC. Take those best things, discard some of the things that, maybe don't provide the best experience for the customer or for the employees, discard those things, then replace those with, other, best thinkings and kind of pull it all together into, one playbook that's not rooted in one particular company, one particular methodology, but kind of rooted in all that diversity. And then the other thing too is, as you look at, different roles, right? You can benefit by having, diverse experience, because on the customer success side, we're solving problems that, 10 years ago, people weren't thinking about, right? So having kind of a bit of a diverse team thinking about how we're going to solve those problems, because ultimately what we're doing is we're defining much like PTC defined the sales playbook, we're defining the customer success playbook for the next generation, right? And so, we've got, diverse people, from all over the world thinking about how are we going to solve this problem, right? How are we going to do partner success, right? Very few people are doing that. So we're like paving new ground in those areas. And so, that's where also diversity of thought, I think can be important as well, because it brings creativity, new ideas and different ways of thinking. And at the end of the day, our customers are diverse. So, we need to be thinking about it not only through the lens of, how do we get business done, but also how do we do it in a way that delivers a positive experience for our customers.
Right. So I suppose in terms of kind of general advice that you'd give to our listeners, what kind of advice would you, to those listening that are perhaps interested in customer success or kind of exploring a path similar to that of your career trajectory, what's the best advice you could give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sort of individuals, I think, the advice I would give is, a couple of things. So one is, I think, customer success is, I think a great area of opportunity, particularly for folks who have, experience in, the domains like sales engineering, professional services, things like that. So, don't be afraid to sort of take the leap. You've seen actually some of the folks from BladeLogic have taken the leap and have started to get more involved, and they branched out, right? I think traditionally, you saw a lot of people stay within sales engineering or maybe go move over to product management, but you tend to see kind of concentration. Some of them become sales reps, right? But I think there's this sort of this other area that, particularly in the context of subscription and SaaS businesses, might be something I think worth looking at, because I think it is a huge opportunity and it's going to be a big area, from a growth perspective. I think for for business leaders and companies, I think don't underestimate the impact a strong customer success organization can have when done well, and don't be afraid to invest a bit, in your customers, right? The thing I always ask is, for every dollar of bookings or revenue that we have, how much of that are we willing to invest back in the success of our customers? And if you're willing to make that investment, it's going to pay for itself, right? It's going to pay for itself through retention and expansion, consumption, for a lot of businesses, that's critical. Like, it's going to pay for itself if done right, if invested well and then done right. And, and that's, financial investment, but also hiring the right people and, getting the right people in those roles and investing in the right tools and systems. It's going to more than pay for itself.
Mm.
Right.
And outside of customer success, Phil, in terms of individuals watching this who are looking to scale their career in different roles in technology companies, what are the kind of key attributes or drivers for you, or areas of development you've focused on to scale your career in the way you have?
I think, there's sort of the core, the core skills, right? Around, the things like problem solving and being able to work as part of a team, which also includes, being able to be transparent and upfront, with folks, like if you don't agree. I think those are all, really important, aspects. I think the other thing too is just being, not being afraid to take a chance, right? Being able to tolerate a little bit of risk, right? I remember when I left Accenture, right? I remember at the time I went to work at a startup company and had a, conversation with my dad at the time. He basically went something like this. He's like, so let me get this straight. You have a really well-paying job that's pretty stable. You like what you're doing. You could literally stay at this company, forever, and make lots of money. But you're going to leave. You're going to quit to go work for this startup company where you're making less money. There's no clarity on your job. There's a lot of uncertainty. And you think that's the better thing to do for your career. And I was like, absolutely. It's like, sometimes you got to be willing to take a chance, right? Whether it's take a chance in a different role, take a chance at a different company, and also be willing to put in the time, right? In the roles I was in, I was always in them for 12 to 18 months, right? In some of the roles I've been in for years, right? I mean, I think to master customer success, that's an investment I need to make for years. It's not something I can learn in 6 months. It's not something I can learn in 12 months. So don't be afraid to take the chance. But at the same token, the only way you can get experience is over time, right? Through experience, right? And so I think that's an important consideration as well.
Right. So I suppose as a final question, we ask as part of the pre-sale series is, what technology or area of innovation do you think is going to have the biggest impact on business in the next decade?
Yeah. It's interesting. This isn't a technology, but I think it's going to drive innovation. And it's really what's happening today, right? So if you think about the world we live in right now with COVID, right? And you think about, the fact that we need to adapt in kind of like new ways. I think there is going to be a lot of innovation that comes out of that, out of like necessity. And also I think there's going to be a lot of impact, positive impact and, sort of, negative impact. I think about, like my nephew as an example. So he is a chef. Okay. So restaurants are, shutting down, closing, laying people off. Right. So what does he do? He basically, creates a service where it starts out as he's a chef from home cooking for tons of families, all over the community with literally like a Google sheet where people can put in their orders. right? And now all of a sudden he's finding that he can, hit so many more people in terms of like delivering his craft. He can do it, deliver so many more meals to so many more people and make even more money. And by the way, now he's also replicating that concept to like other communities, right? Where he's personally hiring the chefs. Like, so that's an example of like the innovation that comes out of, something like this. I think about, I live in the Boston area. As a kid, we had like, snowstorms, right? Well, now education's being delivered remotely, and my kids' schools are on, I think, the forefront of doing like the best job delivering virtual school, live, instructor led, combined with digital. There's no more concept of a snow day ever again, right? I mean, there was snow in the forecast. They said we're just going to do virtual school tomorrow, right? But also when you think about now being able to take that quality education and you could deliver it to anywhere in the world, right? Whether someone just has, all they need is an internet connection and a device. And someone in, Uganda can get the same education as, my son in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, right? Like, so there's like, there's all this innovation that I think is going to be, forced because companies are forced to accelerate their digital transformation and people are forced to think about, different ways. And it's underpinned by a lot of technology shifts that have been happening, right? The shift to the cloud, right? Sort of network, bandwidth and things, like 5G and things like a lot of it's underpinned by a lot of the technology shifts that have been happening. But I think as you start to apply that new ways, and I think, COVID is going to be a compelling factor in so many different areas, transformation of medicine, the transformation of, cities. What does public transportation look like in a world where, people are a bit skittish about, being on the underground, sort of shoulder to shoulder, with everyone, right? Like, I think it starts to transform everything and becomes a compelling event to drive more innovation, on top of a lot of the technology shift that we've seen happening.
Great, fantastic. Well, Phil, that was very, 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 very eloquently pertinent. Thank you so much. So I suppose this is a good time to really summarize what we've heard today, Phil. And I think we've heard the story of an individual that is able to run towards lots of different challenges and be so useful, almost as a kind of a utility player. And the reason why you're so effective in so many different positions, in my opinion, is that everything you do is centered around understanding the importance of customer value. And whether or not you're doing a pre-sales role or doing a post-sales role or a customer success role, you're able to understand customer value and understanding how it comes together with sales and the customer engagement. And this has enabled you to continue to grow and to evolve and to be able to be positioned by your senior execs to tackle very, very strategic challenges that need to be worked out. And it's by taking that mindset and obviously your ability to adapt that you've obviously been able to continue to scale. And this is the reason why at the moment you are, really taking the fight to, the next frontier, which is customer success at one of the best technology companies in the world. So Phil, I just want to take this moment to really thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really, really insightful. Lots of great insight and lots of depth. And I'm sure that our listeners and viewers have really taken lots from today.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Patrick. It's been, great getting a chance to know you. And I certainly, encourage, your viewership to check out, all the podcasts in the series. I mean, there's so much valuable information that, you guys are helping, promote and get out there, and so many playbooks. I'm just, honored to be a part of the experience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil. It's been fascinating. Thank you again for joining us.
So to our listeners and to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in with us today. We hope you've enjoyed what you've seen and what you've heard. There's lots and lots of more information to be found on our blog page, so please do check out somuchsoap.com/blog. There's lots more lined up in the series and lots more happening, so do stay tuned, and we look forward to welcoming you soon in the future. Thank you very much.